In the 18th century, Europe was undergoing a revolution. Without banners or barricades or bloodshed, it was called the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. The revolutionaries weren't violent. They were a handful of thinkers and doers, artisans, merchants, scientists, and in one case, all of those things in a single individual. When I was a boy growing up here in the Potteries, Josiah Wedgwood was regarded with awe as the first great artist-industrialist. Wedgwood was a founding father of the Industrial Revolution, with a relentless urge to change science, technology, transport, the welfare of mankind, and the retail experience of society ladies. And he did it all from a muddy village in the middle of nowhere. Achievements that might be better known if it wasn't for his magnificent ceramics. Josiah Wedgwood wasn't just a famous potter. He transformed Britain itself. I've a special relationship with Josiah. I had a privileged upbringing, here, in the Wedgwood factory. This was my childhood playground. In the 50s, my father, Norman Wilson, was production director. On Saturdays, he'd bring me to these works when he came to talk glazes and kiln technology. He was a potter. All my family were for some 10 generations. But I had a different destiny. As a boy, I knew Josiah Wedgwood to be a hero, like Stanley Matthews or Yuri Gagarin. As a writer, I find him fascinating. Why do I want to write about Wedgwood? He combines so many different qualities in one human being. And he believed in beauty. He wanted to make beautiful objects, and he wanted to leave the world a more beautiful place, which in my belief he did. An extraordinary inventor, of course. But he really had a completely new take on English society. So that fascinates me. There's another reason. I was a witness to history when the company went through a post-war renaissance, but too young to appreciate it all. What linked my father and his colleagues to the great potter? Did Wilson and Wedgwood have something in common? I'm going to navigate my way through Josiah Wedgwood's story via my own selection of 5 pivotal pots. I believe each will illustrate a turning point or theme, keys to understanding a remarkable life lived in one of the most exciting periods of our history. The Georgian era is still all about us, in art, literature, and grand architecture. It's as relevant today as it was then, made by people we feel familiar with. We think of the 18th century as all this: elegant squares, proportion, periwigs, brocaded coats, the age of reason, Haydn playing in the background. And it was. But in the early 18th century, in a small provincial village like Burslem, where Josiah was born in 1730, things would have been as undeveloped as they had been in 1530. In the 18th century, the village of Burslem was not the metropolis it is today. Unlike today, this town and the 5 others that make up Stoke-on-Trent were a centre of industry, the pottery industry. The Wedgwoods had operated potworks here for 4 generations. Josiah was born in the family pottery beside St. John's Church, known as the Churchyard Works. His father Thomas would be buried there just 9 years later. Jos was the youngest of 8 surviving children. Their world was built on clay. The pots that came from Burslem were, understandably, a variety of rich, dark colours, or else a muddy cream made using lighter clay chipped in from Cornwall. For centuries, the British ate and drank from these very serviceable wares. But by the middle of the 18th century, a new kind of consumer was emerging, one who wanted something tasteful. Historian Jeremy Black.
From the mid-18th century, you have the development of what they would have called at the time the middling orders. They didn't really use the term the middle class. Britain is becoming a much more prosperous country. People wish to display their taste. On the same time, of course, sugar is coming into the country, coffee is coming into the country, chocolate is coming into the country, so that the actual sociability is increasingly structured round drinking, stimulating sort of beverages.
So the man who's making nice tea sets and coffee sets is in business, basically.
The man who's making nice coffee sets and tea sets, Josiah Wedgwood, is really in business. It is a active, urbane life which requires a set of goods, a set of products to actually help you feel elegant.
Josiah knew few members of the middle classes, but he'd worked for potters who sold to dealers in London, Liverpool and Birmingham, then known as Brummagem. With a gammy leg and a restless, inquiring mind, Josiah Wedgwood felt ready in 1759 to set up on his own.
To all lovers of art, this should be a place of pilgrimage. For it was here, when he was not yet 30, that Wedgwood moved into his beautiful ivy-clad cottage and started the so-called Ivy Works. Surrounding him on every bit of this hillside there would have been smoking kilns of other potteries, producing on the whole rather crude stuff, red and cream ware, coloured novelty ware. What was he to make? Well, Wedgwood was a businessman. He made what would sell.
And what did sell, like hot cakes, was pottery that reminded the new urban money of the rustic idyll they'd left behind. The first pot in my voyage around Josiah Wedgwood represents the young businessman at 30 with a gift for making and marketing that set him apart. This pot is for serving tea, a fashionable drink, and it wasn't for the hovels of Stoke. It was destined for the tables of urban sophisticates who would be seduced by its lustrous green glaze. At the Wedgwood Museum, curator Gay Blake Roberts has just a few of his glaze experiments on file.
Wedgwood constantly ran trials, constantly worked on experiments, and these are just some of them.
Wow. So he's trying out his bright greens.
He's trying out his enamel colours.
What chemicals are going to go into these?
The green comes from copper oxide.
My father was a potter, always used to say, in order to be a potter, you have to be a chemist as well. And Wedgwood, I suppose, is the supreme example of that, isn't it? Because he's a brilliant chemist.
Yes, without any chemical training. It was totally picked up by trial and error. When you actually look at something like those, you suddenly realise how dedicated he was.
Look at all the numbers of times he tried. Hundreds of experiments.
Hundreds and hundreds.
That's staggering, isn't it?
These objects went on to actually form the nucleus of the pots that we now think of as Wedgwood.
Josiah devoted himself so assiduously to glazes because as a potter he had a major disadvantage. When he was 11, smallpox left Josiah with a nasty tumour behind his right knee. The foot-operated wheel of the day was very uncomfortable to him. He gravitated towards other aspects of the business: glazes, kiln technology, labour relations, and marketing, things ripe for change. Questioning the way things were done in the pottery came naturally to a boy whose family dared to question the nature of God. They were Unitarians, dissident Christians.
The Unitarianism is an important part of Josiah Wedgwood. He came here regularly and brought his family here when he was a married man with children. To be a Unitarian was to question the status quo. You weren't part of the establishment. Yes, you believed in God, but beyond that, you didn't subscribe to any orthodoxies. It meant that you passionately believed in free inquiry, in intellectual life, and he certainly believed in the education of both of boys and of girls. Underlying it also is this very, very strong sense of morality. He was, in many senses, a bit of a Puritan.
Historian Jenny Udlow has studied 18th century society in depth. Today we take religious freedom for granted. How different are we from the Georgians?
England is far more tolerant than we might think. You could more or less believe what you liked. In fact, there is a range of dissenting beliefs which goes completely to sort of millenarianism and the Second Coming. A lot of the discrimination in Britain is actually not about the nature of belief. It's not theological. It's about class. It's an idea that the dissenting folk are people to do with business, with trade, or also the poor workers in the factories. If you wish to be a respectable member of society, you are an Anglican.
It's a purely snob view, isn't it?
It is. There was a lot of snobbery connected with religion. Technically, there were enormous disadvantages. You couldn't go to the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. You couldn't hold an official position. You couldn't be a magistrate, for example, or a member of Parliament. But this meant that the dissenters, many of whom were men and women of considerable initiative and go-ahead, created their own culture. They were free, to think their own way forward.
As the 1760s began, in the Ivy work, Wedgwood, unlike some of his fellow Potters in Stoke, was thinking differently about the muddiness of the local cream-coloured earthenware. A small businessman with few employees, still throwing pots himself, a bachelor of simple tastes, he devoted every spare moment to experimentation. Pivotal pot number 2. This isn't any creamware, this is Wedgwood creamware. The clarity of colour, the result of some 5,000 glaze tests. This pot represents the kind of ware that will make him a household name around the world. But at 30, all that was yet to come. Brian Dolan is a California professor with a passion for the genius of Burslem.
The creamware that he produced was a much richer and much purer kind of color and texture than anyone had seen before. Now, in addition to that, he made sure that the saucers and the tops of the saucers fit tightly, that everything was proportioned correctly, which originally made him stand out from the others.
Demand was high among the English for minimalist earthenwares that told the neighbours you had good taste. And then a new kind of client emerged who was even more needy.
It's 1760. Wedgwood is the right man in the right place at the right time. This is a period when Britain is becoming the great merchant nation of the world, and when exports are booming as never before. And a key part of that market is America. This was a time when Americans were settling down, they were building cities, and they wanted to have houses which were as comfortable, as well equipped, as well designed as houses in Bath, in Bristol, in Stoke-on-Trent. They wanted nice furniture, they wanted nice china, they wanted pottery, and there wasn't a single pottery manufactory in the whole of the 13 colonies. So Wedgwood could see the market opportunity of a lifetime.
Britain is the greatest trading nation in the world by the late 18th century. It has reconfigured its geography. I mean, Britain, if you look in the medieval period, of course, traded with Europe. But the opening up of the Atlantic world, which had initially benefited the Iberians, Spain and Portugal most, created a set of commercial relationships in which the British, in part because they have the freest system, the most liberal, or we would say capitalist system of commercial organisation rather than a state-regulated one, they are really at the forefront of that.
America would become Wedgwood's most important overseas market. As a Unitarian, he championed the settlers' right to self-rule, and he traded with the Cherokee to obtain fine clays. Josiah's creamware was in great demand, but he had to keep improving it. His quest was a glaze the colour of driven snow, something the competition hadn't even considered.
Josiah had a feeling that through more experimentation, he could find that new something that would dazzle everybody. He wanted equal colors around, and he wanted the whole appearance of it to be a brilliant white.
Every variation in glaze and clay was tested and fired in his kilns, recorded in a secret code.
What he finally discovers after toiling for months in the laboratory was just the right formula that he could bake at just the right temperature for just the right amount of time in order for him to get what he calls the good white glaze.
The white glaze put Wedgwood on the map. As he began to become a household name, he spent more time in the capital, cajoling dealers and observing the habits of London society, what he called the virtuosi.
He had an extraordinary affinity for the kind of things which would appeal to people, and he had a particular feeling, I think, for feminine taste and what women wanted to see on their dining tables. His good white glaze, his creamware, had become something that every family in England wanted, and indeed his very surname, Wedgwood, had become synonymous with the finest ceramics.